The last serial killer to be executed by hanging in Washington state, Charles Campbell. In 1976, he was imprisoned for an assault and sodomy crime, sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, 6 years later, driven by a strong desire for revenge, he exploited a loophole in the judicial system to carry out a meticulously planned triple murder. As for whether God will forgive Charles, no one knows. But the human court has already given a fitting answer. Even his own parents said that executing Charles was the only way to ensure he would never harm anyone again. So why did Charles become a heartless, conscienceless man who resorted to violence to solve everything, even said he would try to harm anyone who got close to him? The root of the problem lies in his childhood and adolescence. October 21st, 1954, Charles was born into an ordinary family on Oahu Island, Hawaii. But the family life was far from harmonious. His father was a Marine influenced by both alcohol and war memories, and his mother was equally fond of drinking. So the house was always filled with the smell of alcohol and the sound of quarrels, and Charles often witnessed his father's domestic violence against his mother. A psychological report in 1982 showed that Charles had complex feelings towards his father. He admired his father's behavior while thinking his mother was weak and overly controlling. This distorted perception is a manifestation of the chaos and contradictions deep in his heart. Age 13, Charles was exposed to alcohol and drugs, such as amphetamines and heroin. October 29, 1970, 8 days after his 16th birthday, his father reported to the police that he had stolen the family car. In July 1971, his mother reported him to the police for running away from home. However, she also publicly declared that she had given up on Charles and would not worry about his running away, preferring that he never return home. The next day, Charles was arrested by the police. At that time, he had also broken into his grandparents' home, stealing several firearms in an attempt to raise travel funds to go to California. For stealing his grandparents' guns, Charles was detained at the Green Hill School in Chehalis between 1971 and 1972. There, he revealed his strong, vengeful nature and ability to bide his time. At that time, Charles was seen as a rebellious student. However, only a few people who had paid attention to Charles understood his personality. His former tutor said that he was a student who was easily overlooked. The school's principal, Williams, stated that he was a truly cold-blooded individual, claiming that he would harm anyone who got close to him. Apparently, Charles had developed antisocial tendencies during this period. In August 1973, Charles left Green Hill School, and soon after he chose to get married. In his family life, he, like his father, always inflicted domestic violence on his wife. But his behavior was more severe. He even threatened to kill several of her family members and her dog. Their daughter was born in March 1974, but 20-year-old Charles was completely unable to take on the responsibilities of a father. He would often become angry at the sound of his daughter's crying and once even threw a butcher knife at her. Because of this incident, in August 1974, his wife chose to divorce him and took their daughter with her. The departure of his wife and daughter left Charles without an outlet for his emotions, and ultimately, he embarked on his criminal career. On December 11, 1974, winter day in Clearview, Washington, Renee Wickland was doing gardening at her doorstep, and her daughter, Shanna, only a few months old, was sleeping soundly. Suddenly, Charles approached Renee from behind. Before she could react, a knife was already pressed against her throat. Charles threatened Renee with the knife, demanding that she perform oral sex on him, and said menacingly, "If you don't cooperate, I'll kill your daughter." In order to protect her daughter, she reluctantly succumbed. After the assault, Charles hurriedly left, and Renee collapsed to the ground, trembling as she dialed the emergency number and reported everything to the police. 2 years later, Charles was finally arrested for the case. Before his arrest, no one knew what he had been doing in these 2 years. Standing in court, Charles claimed his innocence, but Renee and her neighbor Barbara testified in detail about the assault. Barbara also described Renee's psychological state after the attack. She stated that after the incident, Renee had a vacant look in her eyes, as if she had lost her soul. She also separated from her husband Jack and took on the responsibility of raising her daughter Shanna alone. In order to make a living, she worked as an accountant from home and helped students obtain loans for beauty school. She tried to get her and her daughter's life back on track, but the inner wounds were hard to heal. On May 11, 1976, Charles was sentenced to a total of 40 years in prison for 3 counts, including the assault and sodomy of Renee, as well as an unrelated 1976 burglary. He was incarcerated in a reformatory in Washington state. However, he never followed the rules there. He stole yeast from the kitchen to illegally brew homemade alcohol, assaulted other inmates multiple times, and more shockingly, raped at least 2 fellow prisoners, threatening to kill them if they reported to the prison authorities. In addition, he had an inappropriate relationship with a female prison counselor who abused drugs and had a son with her. In January 1979, a prison psychologist conducted a psychological reevaluation of Charles. The results of the reevaluation were not surprising at all. Charles was prone to conflict, exhibited multiple antisocial tendencies, disregarded the feelings of others. The psychological report also noted that Charles was indifferent to others, lacked a conscience, and maliciously could not tolerate the social order that had imprisoned him. He posed an imminent danger to anyone who directly or indirectly attracted his attention or interest. However, despite Charles' repeated violations of prison discipline and disturbing psychological evaluations, the Washington State Parole Board waived his mandatory sentence in June 1981. And this decision also made Charles eligible to be downgraded to a minimum security custody status, awaiting a parole hearing date in May 1983. In October 1981, Charles was placed in the Monroe Reformatory in Washington state, which was established to help prisoners gradually reintegrate into society, but he did not cherish this opportunity. Sometime between December 25, 1981 and January 4, 1982, his ex-wife accused Charles of raping her. Later, Charles committed 4 further disciplinary offenses. On April 14, 1982, Renee was sick and confined to bed. Her 8-year-old daughter, Shanna, was sitting by her side, keeping her company. Around 4:20 in the afternoon, Renee's neighbor Barbara came to her house with a concerned heart. 2 hours later, around 6:30 in the evening, Barbara's husband, Donald, arrived at Renee's house. He just wanted to see his wife and say hello to Renee. However, as soon as he pushed open the door to Renee's house, the scene in front of him shocked him instantly, followed by uncontrollable horror and grief, because the remains of Renee, Shanna, and Barbara were scattered in different rooms of the house. Barbara's throat was slashed. Renee's head, back, and chest were severely beaten. Her jaw and nose were broken. There were marks of strangulation on her neck, and there were signs of sexual assault. Shanna's neck was cut so deeply that she was almost decapitated, with an extremely severe blood loss of up to 95%. After the incident, the investigators carefully examined the crime scene. They found a drinking cup with a bloodied fingerprint. And one of Renee's neighbors provided an important clue to the police. She had seen a man walking around Renee's yard in a suspicious manner with a knife that morning, as if he was looking for an opportunity. Other neighbors also saw him walking towards the house with a large roll of blanket. When the police questioned Donald, he said that the only person he could think of as the possible murderer was the man who had attacked Renee 8 years ago. Meanwhile, a fellow work-release prisoner of Charles provided a crucial clue to the police. He told the police that on the evening of April 14th, he and Charles had been to a place by the Snohomish River and noticed Charles secretly throwing some items into the river. Based on this clue, the police quickly organized a dive team to search the river. Eventually, they retrieved several pieces of clothing, accessories, and jewelry from the river. On April 19th, Charles was arrested at the Monroe Reformatory and charged with first-degree murder. Dried blood was found on the door handle of his car, and Shanna's earrings were discovered on the back seat. In November 1982, the courtroom in Washington state was filled with a somber atmosphere as a life-or-death trial was underway. In the defendant's seat, Charles remained silent, refusing to testify on his own behalf and declining to discuss the shocking murder case. Meanwhile, witnesses for the prosecution successively took the stand. The female prison counselor, who was Charles's girlfriend at the time, also testified. She said that Charles harbored considerable resentment towards Renee and had driven past her house several times during his work release period. The defense attorneys appeared somewhat powerless during the trial. They did not call any witnesses or present any evidence, but instead repeatedly emphasized that this case was a miscarriage of justice. In addition, many residents signed a petition demanding the death penalty for Charles. In the end, after careful consideration, the jury agreed with the citizens' demands. They believed that Charles showed no remorse for the murders of Renee, Shanna, and Barbara. Throughout the trial, he mostly remained calm and spoke little. Even when the crime scene and autopsy photos were displayed in the courtroom, he did not show much obvious emotion. On November 26, 1982, after several days of trial, the jury ultimately found Charles guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. On December 17th, the judge formally sentenced him to death. Since Charles was unwilling to discuss the details of the murders, investigators could only roughly piece together the sequence of events on April 14th. Apparently, driven by hatred, Renee was likely the first victim to be attacked. Shanna was found lying in the next bedroom. Investigators believe Charles may have shown the girl her mother's body before slitting her throat to amplify her fear. When Barbara entered Renee's house, Renee and Shanna were probably already dead. Upon witnessing the horrific scene, Barbara attempted to flee but crossed paths with Charles and was ultimately killed as well. During his time on death row, Charles's mother expressed conflicting emotions. She stated that she still loved him, yet simultaneously supported the death penalty. She once claimed Charles had engaged in sexual relations with a pet dog he had adopted, and upon learning of his first-degree murder arrest, she told investigators, "I never believed he would end up anywhere but in the electric chair." Charles's father and siblings made no public appearances or statements. In 1982, a Seattle psychiatrist conducted a psychological evaluation of Charles. In his report, he confirmed Charles showed no signs of brain damage but held an unorthodox, antisocial perception of reality. Charles told him, "The world made me. I can do whatever I want. There is no right or wrong, and no one can tell me what to do." This twisted worldview was the root of his criminal path. In 1994, after a decade of repeated appeals and delays, Charles's execution was finally scheduled for May 27, 1994. In the 24 hours leading up to the execution, Charles' biological parents and siblings did not visit him, nor did his ex-wife. The last people he saw were his girlfriend, his son, and the female prison counselor who had given birth to his child. On the day of the execution, Charles's witnesses included 12 journalists from various media outlets, 3 relatives of the victims' families, the Snohomish County prosecutor, and his attorney. Due to fear, Charles had great difficulty walking, and standing guards had to strap him to a wooden board and carry him to the gallows. At 12 minutes past midnight, the trapdoor was opened, and 6 minutes later, he was dead. Additionally, in Washington state, death row inmates were given the choice between lethal injection and hanging, but hanging was the default method of execution. If an inmate refused to choose, hanging would be their ultimate fate. Charles was one such inmate who refused to make a choice, so his method of execution was defaulted to hanging. Charles also wrote a letter to the governor of Washington state. In the letter, he referred to himself as both a victim and a defendant, requesting a face-to-face meeting in the hope that the governor would observe his sincerity, frankness, and demeanor. However, the governor of Washington state denied his request. After the execution, no one claimed Charles's body. As per regulations, his body was cremated. When prison staff cleaned out Charles's cell afterward, they found a 4-inch piece of metal. He had been sharpening it, though it was unclear whether it was for suicide, fighting, or an escape attempt. The story did not end with Charles's death. In reality, even though he had killed 3 people, he was not considered a serial killer until 2023, when an unsolved murder case was linked to him. This murder took place in 1975, 5 months after Charles assaulted Renee. Hallie Ann Seaman was an outstanding student at the University of Washington, just 2 semesters away from earning her master's degree in architecture. Friends described her as a smart, strong-willed, and athletic young woman, yet her life was tragically cut short on the evening of April 29, 1975. She was last seen sitting at a drawing table in the University of Washington's architecture building, intently studying how to design quality low-income housing. The next afternoon, a man discovered Hallie's body hidden in the bushes at the edge of the parking lot on the east side of Eastlake Avenue during his lunch break. Seattle police quickly arrived at the scene, and after questioning nearby students, learned that within 40 minutes of Hallie leaving the architecture building, A witness had seen a man loading an unconscious or comatose woman into a white vehicle near the intersection. Consequently, they confirmed that hours earlier, Hallie had been abducted to an unknown location, sexually assaulted, and repeatedly stabbed. Her vehicle was later set on fire 4 miles south of where her body was discovered. This case shocked the entire campus and community, but the perpetrator seemed to vanish into thin air, never to be found. It wasn't until nearly 50 years later that technological advances and a serendipitous discovery brought the true culprit to light. Given Hallie's youth and the seemingly random nature of her murder, the case had lingered in the minds of the Seattle Police Department. For years, they worked diligently to uncover clues. In 2002, an officer submitted forensic evidence preserved from Hallie's autopsy to the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. Unfortunately, there was no match in existing databases. By the time a police officer named Norton took up the case, modern technology had introduced genetic genealogy, a technique that infers familial relationships and family history by analyzing genetic information. This technology has been widely used in serial killer investigations in recent years, such as the Golden State Killer and Gilgo Beach serial murders, so he decided to employ it and submitted the perpetrator's DNA. In August 2023, Norton received an email from a forensic scientist at the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The content revealed that the test results linked Charles to Hallie. Although Charles would never be held accountable for Hallie's murder, it meant that the identity of her killer would no longer be a mystery,